In the early days of World War II, the lives of children in Britain were shaped by a false sense of security, a peaceful existence that had existed for generations, a world not yet touched by the horrors of the war. It was a time of innocence, where children played freely in their neighborhoods, their laughter filling the air, as their minds remained untainted by the suffering that the conflict in Europe had brought. The sun hung in the sky with the warmth of autumn, casting long shadows over fields of gold and amber leaves. These children, much like any others, were oblivious to the impending storm. They went to school, played on playgrounds, and sat around their family tables, sharing stories of the day's events. They had no reason to fear the coming winter, but the tranquility they knew would not last. As Europe was engulfed in flames, Britain too found itself drawn into the darkness of war. The air was thick with tension, and the whispers of an approaching conflict reached every corner of the island. No one truly understood the magnitude of what was coming, and no one could predict how deeply the war would impact every aspect of their lives, especially for the children. The first signs of change were subtle but undeniable. The sight of men and women in uniforms began to grow more frequent on the streets, the sounds of military trucks rumbling through the cities a sign that something larger was unfolding. The once distant news of battles in distant lands began to feel alarmingly close. The looming dread of bombs dropping from the sky began to fill the minds of those who had once been insulated from the horrors of war. Then came the sirens. It was a sound that would become etched into the memories of every child who lived through those years. At first, the sirens were a distant, almost surreal sound, something out of a nightmare, something that didn't seem to belong in the world they knew. When the first shrill wail filled the air, it was as if the very earth beneath them had shifted. It was a warning, a harbinger of destruction, and the children had no idea what it meant, other than it was something they were not supposed to ignore. Their parents, their teachers, and even the neighbors moved quickly, with urgency in their steps, as the streets began to empty, and windows were sealed with black tape. The children watched in confusion, their innocent minds unable to comprehend the full gravity of the situation. Within minutes, the streets were deserted, save for the occasional figure darting between buildings or huddling in doorways, seeking shelter. The children were quickly ushered into their homes, where the safety of the familiar walls provided a false sense of comfort. They sat in their rooms, their small bodies pressed against windows, looking out into the distance at a world suddenly shrouded in fear. Their eyes were wide with questions that their parents couldn't answer, their hearts racing with a sensation of impending doom that seemed to be growing louder with each passing moment. The first bombs fell in the heart of London, and the rest of Britain followed. The air became filled with the whistling of death, the thunderous roar of bombs exploding in distant neighborhoods. The once peaceful sky was now filled with the ominous hum of aircraft, a sound that seemed to echo through every street and every corner of the city. Children, huddled together in cellars or underground shelters, listened to the terrifying sounds of the bombs raining down above them, their young minds struggling to make sense of the world outside. They had been warned, told that this war was coming, but no one had prepared them for the sheer brutality of its arrival. The fear that gripped the adults was now palpable in the eyes of the children. There was no longer a safe place, no place to hide from the sound of explosions that felt like they were shaking the very ground beneath their feet. The shelters, once a temporary refuge, became their new reality. The children began to learn quickly that this would not be a passing storm, but an ongoing war that could reach them anywhere at any time. There were no rules in this new world. There were no guarantees, no promises of safety. Their homes, their schools, their playgrounds, everything they had once known and taken for granted, was now vulnerable to the whims of a war that had no mercy. As the raids continued, the children's fear deepened. The sound of sirens became a signal, a constant reminder that they were never truly safe. Each time the wail of the siren cut through the air, they knew they would have to leave the warmth of their beds, the comfort of their homes, and retreat into the cold, dank shelters. The shelters were dark and cramped, and the children would huddle together, seeking warmth in each other's presence. They clung to their parents, their brothers and sisters, for comfort and security. But the fear never left them. It was a constant presence, a shadow that loomed over them day and night. Even when the bombing stopped, even when the sirens no longer wailed, the children felt it, the unspoken tension, the sense that danger was always near. But there was more to the fear than just the bombs. It was the overwhelming darkness that seemed to close in on them with each passing night. As the war escalated, the government imposed strict blackout regulations. No lights could be shown after dark, in an attempt to make it harder for enemy bombers to find their targets. The streets that had once been illuminated by the warm glow of street lamps were now cast in deep, suffocating darkness. No lights in windows, no lamps on porches, no illumination on the streets. The world had become a vast, unknowable expanse of shadow. The children, who had once found comfort in the light, now found themselves stumbling through this new, terrifying reality. The fear of the dark became a tangible thing. It wasn't just the absence of light. It was the unknown, the terrifying realization that there were dangers lurking in the shadows. In the daylight, the children had once felt safe. They had known the rhythm of their lives: school, play, meals, bedtime. But now the world had changed. They could not see what was happening around them. They could not predict when the next bomb would fall or where it would land. The shadows felt oppressive, as if they were closing in on them from all sides. The fear was not just of the bombs, but of what might emerge from the darkness. Every rustling sound, every creak of the house, became a potential sign of danger. The children began to dread the night as much as the day. The darkness, which had once seemed so natural and comforting, now felt like a predator ready to pounce at any moment. As winter approached, the cold settled over the land. It was not just the chill in the air, but the cold that permeated everything. The cold of war, of loss, of uncertainty. The children's minds had become conditioned to the constant cycle of terror, a relentless rhythm of fear and survival. It was in this winter darkness, with the air thick and biting, that the true weight of their reality began to settle in. The bright, golden days of summer had faded, replaced by long, dark nights that seemed to stretch on forever. The children began to understand, perhaps for the first time, that this was no longer a temporary disruption. This was a new way of life. And so, in the midst of this great darkness, the children clung to what little comfort they could find. They clung to the memory of the light, to the faint hope that one day, things would return to normal. But for now, they learned to navigate this terrifying new world, one moment at a time. The fear they felt was not just a fear of bombs, of darkness, or of death. It was the fear of the unknown. And it was a fear that would shape their childhoods, their memories, and their futures for years to come. As the war continued to ravage Britain, the atmosphere in the cities grew heavier with each passing day. The once familiar world of children, with its playgrounds, parks, and sunlight-filled streets, seemed to slip further and further away. The Blitz, as the relentless bombing raids were known, tore through the country, leaving a wake of destruction that was both physical and psychological. Families huddled in shelters beneath the earth, clinging to each other in the darkest hours of the night, as the constant fear of death from above became a permanent companion. The fear was palpable, pressing down on everyone, but it was the children who felt its weight most acutely, their young minds struggling to make sense of a world that no longer made sense. In the midst of this chaos, the British government, desperate to maintain morale and a sense of normalcy, began to roll out new initiatives designed to provide some degree of comfort and stability to the population. One such initiative, seemingly small yet deeply symbolic, was the installation of gas lamps throughout the cities. These lamps, powered by gas rather than electricity, had been in use for years, but now, with the blackout regulations in full force, their presence was more critical than ever. The government hoped that by keeping these lamps lit, they could offer a sense of continuity, a faint thread of normality amidst the overwhelming darkness. To the adults, it may have seemed like a minor gesture, but to the children, it was something far more meaningful, something that brought a glimmer of light to their lives, literally and metaphorically. The gas lamps, though not as bright as the electric streetlights of the past, provided a soft, flickering glow along the streets. Their light was pale and faint, barely enough to illuminate the pavement beneath, but it was enough to guide the children through the shadows that had once been a source of comfort but were now a source of dread. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, there was something to hold on to. The darkness, which had become an ever-present terror, was no longer all-encompassing. The lamps offered a semblance of safety, a beacon of hope in a world that seemed to be sinking further into despair. The children, who had once been afraid of the dark, began to find solace in the soft glow of these gas lamps. They would walk along the streets, their small hands clutching their parents' hands or each other's, their eyes wide with curiosity, drawn to the faint light that shone in the midst of the oppressive blackness. It was a reassurance, a reminder that despite the bombs falling above them, life could still continue in some way. The light, though fragile and often flickering, represented something greater than itself. It represented the unyielding spirit of the British people, their determination to endure, to survive, to keep going even when everything seemed to be falling apart. The gas lamps also served another purpose. They became a symbol of defiance. In a world where so much had been lost, where fear had become a constant companion, these lights stood as a small but powerful act of resistance against the forces that sought to destroy them. The lamps were fragile, and their light could be snuffed out at any moment by an air raid, but for that brief moment when they flickered to life, they reminded the people that they were still there, that they were still fighting. It was a small victory, but a victory nonetheless. And for the children, who had known only darkness and fear for so long, it was something to cling to, something to believe in. For a while, these lamps provided a sense of comfort. The children could walk along the streets at night without feeling completely lost in the shadows. They could see their surroundings even if just barely. The lamps helped to create a sense of order in a world that had been turned upside down. The streets, once full of bustling life, were now eerily quiet, the hum of daily activity replaced by the distant sounds of bombs and sirens. But even in the silence, the light of the gas lamps offered a sense of direction. It was as if they were guiding the children through a world that no longer made sense, offering them a tiny thread of normalcy to hold on to. But as with all things in war, this fragile sense of comfort would not last. The bombing raids grew more frequent, more intense, and the very lamps that had once offered solace were now vulnerable to the same forces that had torn apart entire neighborhoods. The children watched as the lamps, one by one, were extinguished, snuffed out by the force of the explosions that rocked the city. The light they had once relied on was gone, and the streets once again plunged into darkness. The soft glow of the gas lamps had been a temporary reprieve, a brief moment of peace in a time of chaos, but now it seemed that even that small comfort was slipping away. The children began to realize, in a way that was both painful and profound, that nothing, no matter how small or seemingly insignificant, was safe from the ravages of war. The lamps, which had once seemed so sturdy, so reliable, were now just another casualty of the bombing. Their light, which had provided such a reassuring presence in the midst of the darkness, was no longer there. The streets, once filled with the comforting glow of the lamps, were now shrouded in an even deeper, more terrifying darkness. The children, once so comforted by the light, now found themselves stumbling through the night once again, unsure of where they were or where they were going. The loss of the lamps was a devastating blow, not just because of the physical darkness that it brought, but because of what it represented. The lamps had been a symbol of hope, of continuity, of the unyielding human spirit. They had been a reminder that, despite the bombs and the death that surrounded them, life could still go on. But now, with the lamps gone, it felt as though that hope had been extinguished along with the light. The children had already lost so much, and now it seemed that even the small comforts they had clung to were being taken from them. But as the war raged on and the darkness deepened, the children of Britain would come to understand something deeper, something that transcended the gas lamps or any other symbol of hope. They would learn that true resilience was not found in external sources of comfort, but within themselves. They would learn to navigate the darkness without the need for light, to find strength in each other and in their own ability to endure. The loss of the lamps was a painful reminder of the fragility of life during wartime, but it also marked a turning point for the children. It was in the absence of light that they would begin to find the true strength of their spirit. In the weeks and months that followed, as the air raids continued and the city was rebuilt from the ashes of destruction, the children learned to adapt. They learned to walk through the darkness without fear, to rely on each other for strength, and to find hope in the smallest of moments. The gas lamps, though gone, had served their purpose. They had shown the children that even in the darkest of times, there was always something to hold on to, something to guide them. And though the lamps were no longer there to light the way, the children had learned to light their own path. The war had taken so much from them, but it had also given them something in return: their own resilience, their ability to survive and to hope, no matter how dark the world around them became. The soft glow of the gas lamps may have been a fleeting comfort, but it was enough to remind them that even in the darkest moments, there was light to be found. And though that light would eventually be extinguished, the children would carry its memory with them, a reminder of the strength that had helped them survive the darkest days of the war. As winter deepened and the war showed no signs of abating, the once familiar world of children in Britain became an increasingly fragmented and chaotic place. The seasonal transition mirrored the emotional and physical toll the war was taking on the nation's youngest generation. The days grew shorter, the nights colder, and the harsh winds of December cut through the streets with a biting relentlessness. But it was the cold that went beyond the weather that began to settle into the very bones of the children, a coldness that could not be warmed by fires or blankets. It was the cold of loss, of fear, and of the unrelenting uncertainty that filled the air. It was the cold of knowing that the world they had known was slipping away, bit by bit, and there was no escaping it. The blackout regulations had intensified over time, and the streets, once filled with the warm glow of gas lamps, now appeared even more inhospitable. The gas lamps that had once provided a fragile sense of reassurance were now few and far between. The air raids continued with unceasing regularity, as the German bombers flew relentlessly overhead, and the sky above Britain became a theater of terror. The first faint flicker of light that the gas lamps had offered had been extinguished in many parts of the city, torn apart by the explosions of bombs that fell like an ever-present cloud of death. As the war dragged on, entire neighborhoods were devastated. The physical destruction was matched only by the emotional devastation that gripped every corner of Britain. Children, once shielded by the boundaries of their innocence, now stood face to face with a world that no longer felt safe. The sound of sirens was no longer a rare occurrence. The wailing shrill that had once filled the air like an ominous omen had become the soundtrack of daily life. The children of Britain began to internalize the fear that came with it, learning that the sound was no longer just a warning, but a call to action. They had learned to run for cover, to dive into air raid shelters, or to huddle together under the flimsy protection of what little they had. They learned that survival wasn't a passive act. It was something they had to actively engage with. They had to find light, even in the darkest of places. The war, with all of its destruction, had taken away so much from them. But it had also given them something in return. The children learned that even when the external sources of safety and comfort were gone, they still had the ability to adapt. They still had the capacity to find meaning and strength in the most difficult of circumstances. It was in the absence of light that they began to understand the true power of resilience. They had been tested by the cold, by the dark, and by the war, but they had not been broken. And though they had lost the gas lamps that had once symbolized their hope, they had found a new source of strength, one that could not be extinguished by bombs or darkness. It was in these quiet moments of adaptation that the children of Britain began to grow. They learned to rely on each other, to find warmth and light in the shared human experience of survival. They had been forged in the fire of war, and though the darkness had threatened to consume them, they had emerged from it stronger, more resilient, and more determined than ever before. And while the world around them was still filled with the sounds of bombs and fear, they had learned the most important lesson of all, that even in the darkest of times, there was always a way forward. As the war dragged on, the relentless rhythm of the air raids and the ever-deepening shadows became a constant in the lives of children in Britain. The days of innocence and carefree childhood were now nothing more than distant memories, erased by the ceaseless barrage of bombs and the terrifying uncertainty that came with every passing day. The bombers above were no longer just a distant threat, something to be feared in theory. They had become an inescapable reality, something that could strike at any moment. It was in this context that the children began to realize just how fragile their lives had become. The gas lamps, once a comforting presence, had now become casualties of war themselves, casualties of the same violence that had torn apart homes, schools, and entire neighborhoods. It wasn't just that the lamps had been extinguished by the bombs, it was that they had been rendered irrelevant in the face of something much greater, an all-encompassing darkness that had descended over the land. The loss of the lamps, which had once offered even the faintest glow of safety, felt like a final surrender to the forces of destruction. The bombs no longer merely shattered the glass or ripped apart the infrastructure of the city, they shattered the very idea that light, however fragile, could persist in a world consumed by war. The children had learned to navigate the darkness, but they had never before considered the idea that the darkness might be permanent. The lamps had been their symbol of hope, of continuity, a small, flickering promise that no matter how much the world around them changed, there would always be something familiar to hold on to. But as the lights went out, one by one, they understood that even the most steadfast of comforts could be swept away in an instant. The streets that had once been illuminated, though faintly, by the gas lamps were now completely shrouded in darkness. The night that had once been merely an inconvenience, a temporary absence of light, now became something far more sinister. It was as if the night itself had come alive, closing in on them, suffocating them with its absence. The children had once feared the darkness, but now, with the lamps gone and the bombs still falling relentlessly, they came to realize that the darkness wasn't just something to be feared. It was something they had to live with, something they had to navigate if they wanted to survive. It was an absence that had swallowed the light, and now it threatened to swallow them whole. In the aftermath of the air raids, the children would emerge from their shelters, their faces pale from the shock of the destruction around them, their eyes wide with fear and disbelief. The streets they had known, the paths they had walked, were no longer familiar. The buildings, once sturdy and imposing, now stood as jagged skeletons, gutted by the bombs. The gas lamps, which had been such a reassuring presence in their lives, were now destroyed, their metal frames twisted and scorched. It was a stark reminder that nothing at all, was immune to the ravages of war. Even the things that had seemed most enduring, most reliable, were now reduced to rubble. The loss of the lamps was not just a physical loss. It was a spiritual one as well. For the children, the lamps had represented more than just a source of light. They had represented a connection to something larger, something outside of themselves. They were a reminder that the world still had order, still had a sense of structure. The lamps were a thread of continuity in a world that was otherwise filled with chaos. They had learned to rely on them, to trust in their fragile glow to guide them through the fear, through the darkness. But now, with the lamps gone, the children were forced to confront a harsher truth, that the world they once knew had been irrevocably changed, and there was no going back. The feeling of loss began to set in, not just for the lamps, but for everything the children had once taken for granted. They no longer had the luxury of wandering freely through the streets after dark, of playing in the parks until the last sliver of sunlight had vanished. The streets were no longer places of exploration or adventure. They had become desolate, dangerous terrain, where every corner could hide an unseen threat. The idea of simply being a child, of enjoying the freedom and innocence of youth, had been taken from them. They no longer lived in a world where they could feel safe, where they could trust in the regularity of things. The war had stripped that away, and in its place, there was only fear, uncertainty, and the ever-looming threat of death. The absence of the lamps also meant that the children were now more vulnerable than ever. With no light to guide them, they had to navigate the streets in total darkness, unsure of what lay ahead. The bombs had already torn apart the city, and now the darkness itself was an enemy, lurking in the corners, waiting for the next opportunity to strike. The children, already used to the terror of the air raids, now had to contend with a new kind of fear, the fear of the unknown. They could no longer rely on the faint light of the gas lamps to give them direction, to offer them any kind of comfort. The darkness was now all-encompassing, and it felt as though the world itself was closing in on them. But it wasn't just the physical darkness that threatened to overwhelm the children. It was the emotional darkness as well. As the war dragged on and the losses mounted, the children began to understand, in a way they had not before, the true cost of survival. The bombs, the broken buildings, the shattered streets, they were visible reminders of the destruction that surrounded them. But it was the emotional toll, the toll of fear and loss, that weighed most heavily on their young shoulders. The children had seen friends and family members killed in the raids. They had seen the faces of neighbors, once full of life, now marked by the scars of war. And they had seen, perhaps most profoundly of all, the slow erosion of hope. Hope had been a fragile thing, something that had flickered like the gas lamps on the streets. At first, the children had clung to it, held onto it tightly as a way to survive. But as the bombs fell and the lamps were extinguished, hope began to feel increasingly out of reach. The world they had once known was gone, replaced by a war-torn landscape where every day brought new uncertainty. The children began to ask themselves, how could they keep going when everything they had once believed in had been shattered? How could they find the strength to survive when it seemed as though the world had abandoned them? It was in this profound darkness that the children began to learn a painful truth. They learned that survival, true survival, was not about the external sources of comfort or security. It was not about the lamps or the shelters or even the comforting words of parents. It was about an internal strength, a strength that came from within. They began to understand that the light they had been looking for, the light that had once been embodied by the gas lamps, had to come from themselves. They could no longer rely on the fragile glow of the lamps to guide them through the dark. They had to learn to find their own light, to become their own source of strength. It was not an easy lesson. The darkness, both physical and emotional, was overwhelming. But over time, the children began to adapt. They found ways to navigate the streets without the light of the gas lamps, learning to rely on their other senses, on the sounds of their surroundings, on the subtle shifts in the air, on the quiet rhythms of their own breathing. They began to understand that survival was not about avoiding the darkness. It was about learning to live with it, to exist within it, to find a way to thrive even in its presence. The loss of the lamps marked the end of an era for the children. It marked the end of a time when they could rely on the external world to provide them with the safety and security they had once known. But in that loss, they found something far more important, the ability to stand on their own, to find hope within themselves, and to navigate the darkness with resilience and courage. The gas lamps, though gone, had served their purpose. They had shown the children the fragility of the world they had once known. But in their absence, the children learned the most important lesson of all, that even in the deepest darkness, there was always the possibility of light. As the winter deepened and the war stretched into yet another unforgiving season, the children of Britain found themselves entangled in a reality that seemed to pull them further from the world they had once known. The stark contrast between what was and what had become of their world could not be more apparent. The light of day, which once offered them a familiar sense of security, had now grown shorter, more elusive. Even the daylight felt pale and fragile, like something they couldn't quite trust. The nights, once marked by the gentle rhythms of bedtime and quiet rest, had become filled with the ceaseless terror of air raids. They had learned to fear the wail of the siren, and now that fear had been ingrained in their very bones, a primal response to the chaos that followed. In the weeks after the gas lamps had been destroyed by the constant bombardment, there was a tangible sense of loss. The once flickering lights that had been their faint assurance in a world filled with shadows were now gone, extinguished by the overwhelming power of destruction that had become their everyday reality. For a while, the children had clung to the belief that the lamps, those fragile beacons, might offer a sense of safety, something to hold onto when everything else felt uncertain. But with their demise, there came a cold, almost palpable awareness of the truth. Nothing was truly safe anymore. And yet, amidst the grief and the pain, something else began to grow. It was subtle at first, like a small crack in a wall that, over time, would spread to reshape the entire structure. This was not the brittle, fleeting hope that they had once drawn from the lamps, but something deeper, something that could not be as easily destroyed. It was a quiet, steady resilience, a sense of survival that began to take root in their hearts.